December 14, 1944. The frozen roads of the Ardennes forest stretched endlessly through the snow-covered pines, where American supply convoys moved at 15 kilometers per hour, their drivers hunched over steering wheels, breath fogging in cabins where heaters had long since failed. Staff Sergeant Raymond Cooper, 26 years old, sat in the passenger seat of the lead truck, his radio equipment pressed against his chest, like a child holding a treasured possession, watching the tree line with eyes that had learned to recognize danger in the patterns of branches and shadows. He believed, as did the 230 men in the convoy behind him, that their greatest enemy was the cold, the ice, the mechanical failures that plagued vehicles never designed for Belgian winters. They could not have been more mistaken about what waited ahead in the darkness between those ancient trees, where soldiers who had been waiting for 3 days in frozen foxholes had positioned anti-tank weapons with mathematical precision, calculating angles and distances with the care of men who understood this would be their only opportunity. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them knew as their 37 trucks laden with ammunition, medical supplies, and rations wound through that forest was that Cooper's unauthorized radio technique, the one that had earned him 3 written reprimands and nearly a court-martial, would become the difference between complete devastation and survival, transforming a banned communication method into the most copied tactical innovation of the entire winter campaign, studied in signal schools and tactical training centers for generations to come, as the perfect example of how battlefield necessity can force institutional transformation. Raymond Cooper had joined the Signal Corps in 1942, a radio enthusiast from Des Moines, Iowa, who had spent his teenage years building crystal sets in his father's garage and talking to strangers across the continent through crackling airwaves that seemed almost magical in their ability to carry voices across impossible distances. His father, Robert Cooper, had worked for the Rock Island Railroad as a telegraph operator for 32 years, and young Raymond had grown up understanding that communication was not just about talking, but about compressing information into efficient patterns that could travel through wire or air and emerge intact on the other side. He had spent countless hours as a teenager listening to his father explain the elegant economy of Morse code, how a trained operator could convey complex messages with minimal transmission time, how rhythm and timing could carry as much meaning as the actual content of the message. Robert Cooper had served in the First World Conflict as a communications specialist in France, and he had returned with stories about how communication failures had cost lives, how poorly trained operators had garbled critical messages, how the difference between victory and defeat sometimes came down to whether information reached commanders in time to make decisions. Young Raymond had absorbed these lessons, had understood from an early age that communication in combat was not an abstract technical exercise, but a matter of life and death for men whose survival depended on clear, rapid information flow. He arrived in North Africa in March of 1943 with the conviction that military radio protocols were sacred texts, designed by brilliant minds who understood warfare better than any farm boy from the Midwest ever could. Men with advanced degrees from prestigious universities and years of experience who had thought through every possible contingency and crafted procedures that would work under any circumstance. The training he had received at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey had reinforced this belief, with instructors emphasizing that protocols existed for critical reasons and that deviation from standard procedure would result in chaos, confusion, and unnecessary casualties. But 12 months of combat communication had taught him something the manual writers had never experienced, sitting in their offices in Washington, composing procedures for soldiers who would die following them. The official protocols were too slow, too verbose, too easily intercepted by enemy listening posts that had learned to recognize American radio patterns like a mother recognizing her child's footsteps. Every transmission required authentication codes that took precious seconds to transmit and verify. Every message needed confirmation through multiple repetitions to ensure accuracy. Every piece of tactical information had to be encoded using standardized cipher systems, transmitted with careful attention to proper format, decoded on the receiving end, and confirmed through a response that itself required authentication. In training exercises conducted in the safety of American bases, where the only consequence of communication failure was a poor grade on an evaluation form, these procedures had seemed reasonable, even elegant in their thoroughness. But in combat, when artillery was falling at rates of 30 shells per minute, and men were dying and every second of delay translated directly into casualties that could be counted and named, the careful protocols felt like trying to write poetry while drowning in ice water. The gap between what the manuals prescribed and what combat demanded had become painfully obvious to Cooper during his first month in North Africa, and it had widened with every engagement he survived. His innovation had started simply enough, almost accidentally, during a firefight outside Palermo in July of 1943, when his radio operator, Corporal James Mitchell from Springfield, Illinois, had been wounded by shrapnel that tore through the canvas side of their truck and caught him in the shoulder and chest. Mitchell had fallen across the radio equipment, blood spreading across the transmitter in patterns that Cooper would remember decades later, and Cooper had grabbed the handset and taken over mid-transmission without thinking, without following the prescribed protocols for emergency operator changes that required informing higher headquarters and receiving authorization to assume radio duties. The unit they were trying to support was pinned down by machine gun fire from 3 separate positions, taking casualties every few seconds, and needed artillery support immediately if they were going to survive the next 5 minutes. Standard protocol required Cooper to identify himself using his complete call sign and authentication code, explain the operator change and its circumstances, re-establish authentication with the receiving station through a series of challenge and response exchanges, and then begin the targeting sequence that itself required multiple steps of verification to ensure the artillery would not strike friendly positions by mistake. The entire process, as prescribed in the training manuals that Cooper had memorized, would have taken at least 2 minutes, possibly 3 if authentication codes needed to be verified through higher headquarters, or if there was any confusion about operator identities. During those 2 to 3 minutes, the pinned unit would continue taking casualties from machine gun fire that was systematically traversing their position, and by the time artillery support arrived, there might be no one left alive to benefit from it. Instead, Cooper had pressed the transmit button twice in rapid succession, a staccato burst lasting perhaps 7/10 of a second that said, "Message received and understood," in less time than it took to pronounce a single word, and then transmitted the artillery coordinates using a compressed format he invented in the moment, stripping away every unnecessary word and authentication step while retaining the essential information about target location, type of fire requested, and urgency level. The transmission lasted 14 seconds compared to the 2 minutes that standard protocol required. The artillery battery, manned by operators who were themselves desperate for clear targeting information and willing to trust anything that sounded authoritative and professional, had adjusted fire within 30 seconds of receiving Cooper's transmission. The machine gun position nearest to the pinned infantry unit was neutralized within 60 seconds. The other 2 positions were suppressed within 90 seconds. Mitchell had survived his wounds, evacuated to a field hospital where surgeons had removed 17 pieces of shrapnel from his shoulder and chest, and somehow kept him alive through an infection that should have been fatal, but responded to the new penicillin treatments that had just become available. The technique had saved perhaps 110 seconds in a situation where men were dying every 10 seconds, which meant Cooper's unauthorized transmission method had likely saved 11 lives that would have been lost if he had followed proper procedure. He had not calculated this precisely at the time, focused entirely on the immediate problem of getting artillery support to men who needed it, but in the days afterward, when he tried to understand what had happened and why it had worked, the mathematics of survival had become undeniable. Cooper continued using variations of the technique over the following months, refining it through trial and error, developing an entire language of taps and pauses that could convey complex tactical information in fractions of the time required by standard procedure. He created distinct patterns for different types of urgent situations. 3 quick taps meant immediate danger requiring complete halt of all movement. 2 taps followed by a pause, followed by 2 more taps meant enemy contact and request for artillery support. 4 rapid taps meant medical evacuation needed urgently. Each pattern was carefully designed to be distinctive and impossible to confuse with any other signal, while remaining short enough that enemy listening posts would struggle to intercept and direction find before transmission ended. He taught the technique to other radio operators in his unit, showing them how the double-tap acknowledgement could replace the standard 6-word confirmation sequence that required saying, "Message received and understood. Please confirm receipt of this acknowledgement." He demonstrated how tactical information could be compressed into numerical codes that both sender and receiver understood through prior agreement. He explained how timing and rhythm could carry as much meaning as the actual words transmitted, creating a kind of battlefield shorthand that operated at the speed of combat rather than the speed of bureaucracy. By September of 1943, his entire company was using variations of the technique, and the results were measurable in ways that military statisticians could quantify and analyze. Response times to tactical developments decreased by an average of 41%. Casualty rates in situations requiring rapid communication dropped by rates that statistical officers initially suspected were reporting errors because the improvements seemed too dramatic to be credible. When analysts compared combat effectiveness between units using Cooper's techniques and units following standard protocols, the differences were stark enough that some commanders began quietly encouraging their radio operators to learn the new methods, despite the fact that these methods had never been officially authorized or incorporated into training curricula. Captain Marcus Whitmore, the signals officer responsible for radio discipline in the 3rd Army Communications Network, had first noticed Cooper's unauthorized transmissions in August of 1944, during the breakout from Normandy, when American forces were advancing so rapidly that communication systems struggled to keep pace with operational tempo that sometimes saw units moving 30 kilometers in a single day. Whitmore was 34 years old, a former telecommunications engineer from Boston who had designed relay systems for commercial radio stations before the conflict, and he understood signal theory with the precision of a watchmaker understanding springs and gears, down to the mathematical relationships between frequency, power, propagation distance, and signal clarity. He had studied at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, earning a degree in electrical engineering in 1931, with a thesis on radio propagation characteristics that had been published in academic journals and cited by other researchers. After graduation, he had spent 13 years building communication networks that connected American cities through invisible webs of radio waves that could carry voices, music, and news across thousands of kilometers. He understood how radio systems worked, not just in theory but in practice, having personally troubleshot equipment failures and optimized network performance through thousands of hours of hands-on engineering work. He also understood military hierarchy, chain of command, and the absolute necessity of standardized procedures in an army that numbered millions of men operating across multiple continents and time zones. Standardization was not bureaucratic obsession, Whitmore believed deeply. It was the foundation of military effectiveness. When every unit followed the same protocols, when every operator used the same procedures, when every transmission followed the same format, commanders could coordinate complex operations involving thousands of soldiers with confidence that their orders would be understood and executed consistently regardless of which specific operators or units were involved. Individual variations, no matter how clever or well-intentioned, introduced unpredictability into systems that required absolute reliability. If one unit used shortened acknowledgement codes while another used standard format, the potential for confusion multiplied dangerously. If operators developed personalized compression techniques that only their immediate colleagues understood, the ability to cross-coordinate between different units deteriorated. Military operations depended on interoperability, on the ability of any unit to communicate effectively with any other unit, and that interoperability required adherence to common standards that everyone understood and followed. When Whitmore reviewed the radio logs and heard the recorded transmissions from Cooper's unit in August of 1944, with their irregular timing and non-standard patterns that violated virtually every protocol in the communications manual, He had immediately recognized both the innovation and the danger. Cooper had created something genuinely clever, a communication system that was demonstrably faster and more efficient than standard protocols in certain tactical situations. The recordings showed transmission times that were fractions of what standard procedures required, with apparent effectiveness in conveying urgent tactical information. But Cooper had also created something that violated every principle of military communications discipline that Whitmore had spent his career learning, teaching, and defending. The technique only worked because everyone in Cooper's immediate unit understood the non-standard codes and patterns through shared experience and informal training. It would create catastrophic confusion if it spread to other units without proper coordination, documentation, and formal training programs, and it had already begun spreading. Copied by radio operators who had heard Cooper's transmissions and tried to imitate them without fully understanding the system or receiving proper instruction in its use. Whitmore had ordered Cooper to report for disciplinary review on August 23, 1944, at division headquarters located in a commandeered French chateau outside the town of Avranches that had somehow survived the fighting with most of its original furniture intact, though the walls bore bullet holes and one corner of the building had been damaged by artillery fire. Cooper had arrived in his combat uniform, still dirty from 3 days in the field conducting convoy operations, his radio equipment hanging from his shoulder in a canvas bag that bore the scars of 2 years of hard use, including burn marks from a vehicle fire and tears from shrapnel that had missed Cooper himself by less than a meter. The first reprimand had been formal but restrained, conducted in a second-floor room that might once have been a library or study, with Cooper standing at attention while Whitmore sat behind a desk and explained, with the patience of a teacher addressing a promising but wayward student, that radio protocols existed for critical reasons beyond mere bureaucratic preference. The captain had genuinely tried to be educational rather than punitive, believing that Cooper was a talented operator who simply needed to understand why the rules existed and why following them was essential despite their apparent inefficiency in immediate tactical situations. Whitmore had explained that enemy intelligence units employed sophisticated direction-finding equipment that could locate radio transmitters within 200 meters, given sufficient transmission time to triangulate signal sources. Every second of transmission time increased the risk that enemy direction-finding equipment would pinpoint the operator's location, allowing enemy artillery to target that position. Standard protocols had been carefully designed to minimize exposure while maximizing information transfer, balancing the need for communication against the danger of detection. The use of authentication codes and verification sequences was not arbitrary complexity, but essential security that prevented enemy forces from transmitting false orders and deceiving American units into friendly fire incidents or tactical mistakes. During the North African campaign, Whitmore explained, enemy forces had successfully impersonated American radio operators on multiple occasions, transmitting false coordinates that caused artillery to strike friendly positions, or sending units into ambush by directing them to supposedly safe areas that were actually under enemy control. Individual operators could not simply invent their own systems, no matter how clever they seemed, because such variations created confusion, increased friendly fire incidents, and compromised the entire communication network's security and efficiency. Whitmore had presented statistical analysis demonstrating how unauthorized radio variations had contributed to 3 separate incidents in July, where artillery fire had struck friendly positions because coordinates transmitted using improvised codes had been misinterpreted by receiving stations unfamiliar with the non-standard formats. In one incident near the town of Marigny, a forward observer had used a compressed coordinate format similar to Cooper's technique to call for artillery fire on enemy positions. The artillery battery receiving the transmission had misinterpreted the abbreviated format, transposing 2 digits in the coordinate sequence. The resulting fire mission had struck an American infantry position, wounding 4 soldiers and destroying 2 vehicles. The investigation had traced the error directly to the use of non-standard transmission format that the receiving operator had not been trained to interpret correctly. Cooper had listened respectfully, standing at attention throughout the 40-minute explanation, and had acknowledged the captain's concerns with apparent sincerity. He understood the logic of Whitmore's arguments. He recognized that his individual cleverness could create systemic problems that affected operations far beyond his own immediate unit. He genuinely wanted to be a good soldier who followed orders and maintained discipline. The military had given him training, equipment, and purpose, and he felt genuine obligation to respect the institution and its procedures. He had returned to his unit with every intention of following proper procedure, determined to prove that he could be as disciplined in his radio operations as any other operator in the division. But 3 days later, when his convoy came under fire from concealed positions near the town of Argentan, and he needed to coordinate artillery support, while simultaneously warning following vehicles to scatter to avoid being caught in a kill zone where enemy gunners had perfectly ranged their weapons, the standard protocols felt like trying to write poetry while drowning. The situation had developed with terrifying speed. The convoy had been moving through an area that intelligence assessments had classified as secure when machine gun fire erupted from tree-line positions on both sides of the road. The lead truck, directly ahead of Cooper's vehicle, was hit immediately, its engine disabled by gunfire that punched through the hood and destroyed critical components. The disabled truck blocked the road, preventing vehicles behind it from advancing, while making them perfect stationary targets for enemy gunners who had clearly planned the ambush with careful attention to creating exactly this kind of trapped situation. Cooper's fingers found the transmit button and tapped out the patterns that had become instinctive, conveying in 8 seconds what would have taken 2 minutes through official channels. He transmitted the convoy's coordinates using compressed format, indicated they were under fire from multiple positions, requested immediate artillery suppression, and directed following vehicles to scatter into side roads and forest tracks to avoid presenting concentrated targets. The artillery adjusted fire with devastating accuracy, the shells landing within 50 meters of their intended targets, despite the complexity of the tactical situation and the speed with which corrections needed to be transmitted. The convoy dispersed before enemy gunners could concentrate fire effectively on the stopped vehicles, with trucks scattering into side roads and forest tracks with the coordination that only came from clear, instant communication. Drivers who received Cooper's transmission understood immediately what they needed to do and where they needed to go, without waiting for additional instructions or clarification. Within 3 minutes, the entire convoy had transformed from a vulnerable column of stopped vehicles into a dispersed force that presented no good targets and had established defensive positions from which they could return fire effectively. Artillery suppression arrived within 4 minutes of Cooper's initial transmission, forcing enemy forces to withdraw from their positions or be destroyed by high-explosive shells that walked systematically through the tree line where muzzle flashes had revealed gun positions. And not a single American soldier was lost in an ambush that should have resulted in dozens of casualties, possibly complete destruction of the entire convoy if the enemy had been able to concentrate fire on bunched vehicles, unable to maneuver or defend themselves effectively. The second reprimand had been considerably less patient. Whitmore had assembled a formal hearing on September 7, 1944, with 3 other officers present as witnesses, including a major from division headquarters and 2 captains from other signal units. The proceeding was conducted with military formality in a room that had been set up specifically for disciplinary actions, with Cooper standing before a table where the officers sat in judgment. Whitmore had presented a written order forbidding Cooper from any future use of unauthorized transmission techniques, reading the order aloud so there could be no misunderstanding about its content or the consequences of violation. The captain had raised his voice during the reading, something the other officers present said he rarely did even when angry, explaining that Cooper's actions, however well-intentioned and however effective they might seem in immediate tactical situations, were undermining the entire communication structure of their division and potentially of the entire Third Army network that connected hundreds of units across thousands of square kilometers. Other radio operators had begun imitating Cooper's technique after hearing his transmissions, creating a cascading effect where no 2 units were communicating according to the same protocols. The imitations were often incomplete or incorrect, because the operators doing the copying had not received proper training in Cooper's system and did not fully understand the codes and patterns he had developed. The result was growing chaos in the communication network, with operators using variations of non-standard techniques that they had learned third-hand or fourth-hand, creating confusion that was beginning to affect operational effectiveness. Intelligence officers could not analyze enemy radio intercepts effectively because they could not reliably distinguish between authorized American transmissions and possible enemy deception. When analysts heard non-standard transmission patterns, they had no way to know whether these represented legitimate American traffic using unauthorized techniques or enemy forces attempting to infiltrate the network. The uncertainty was forcing intelligence units to treat all non-standard transmissions as potentially hostile, which meant legitimate tactical traffic from American units was being flagged as suspicious and delayed, while analysts attempted to verify authenticity. The chaos Cooper had introduced, Whitmore argued with a stack of incident reports as physical evidence, had already contributed to one serious friendly fire incident where artillery had struck American positions because the coordinates, transmitted using improvised codes that the receiving operator had partially understood but partially misinterpreted, had been placed incorrectly by nearly 500 meters. A lieutenant from the 101st Airborne Division had been wounded in that incident when artillery shells landed in his unit's assembly area. 3 enlisted men had been concussed by near misses. 2 vehicles had been destroyed. The damage could have been catastrophic if the artillery had ranged closer to where the forward observer thought he was directing fire. Whitmore had informed Cooper quietly, his voice tight with controlled anger that came from genuine concern about the lives at stake, rather than mere bureaucratic frustration, that the root cause of this incident had been traced through careful analysis of radio logs and witness testimony back to an unauthorized transmission technique that had been incompletely copied from Cooper's original system. An operator who had heard Cooper's transmissions had tried to imitate the compression format without fully understanding it, creating a message that the artillery battery receiving it had misinterpreted. Cooper had accepted the written order, signed the acknowledgement with a hand that did not shake, despite the sick feeling in his stomach at the knowledge that his innovation had hurt American soldiers, and genuinely believed he would comply this time. The captain was right. He had been thinking only about his own unit, his own immediate circumstances, without considering the broader effects of his actions on the entire military communication network. Military organizations were not collections of independent individuals, but complex systems where every action had ripples and consequences that spread far beyond immediate intentions. He would follow the standard protocols, no matter how frustratingly slow they seemed in combat situations, because the alternative was chaos that could cost more lives than the efficiency of his technique saved. The arithmetic of that calculation seemed clear, and Cooper committed himself to following regulations regardless of his personal judgment about their effectiveness. But combat had a way of revealing which rules served survival and which served only the illusion of control. Over the following 2 months, Cooper tried desperately to follow standard protocols, speaking every required code word and waiting for every prescribed confirmation, even when the delays felt like torture, and his instincts screamed that men would die while he was completing authentication sequences. When radio operators using standard protocols died because they could not coordinate defensive fire quickly enough, when convoys were destroyed because warning messages took too long to transmit, when the careful procedures designed in peaceful offices collided with the brutal reality of men trying to stay alive under fire, the choice between following orders and saving lives became unbearably clear. Each time he found himself in situations where following the rules would directly cause American deaths, Cooper chose to break the rules. Each time, he used his double-tap technique to communicate faster than protocols allowed. Each time, men survived who would otherwise have died, and each time, he knew he was moving closer to the court-martial that Whitmore had promised would end his military career and possibly his freedom. 3 times in October and twice in November, Cooper had used unauthorized techniques in situations where standard protocols would have resulted in casualties. He documented each incident carefully in personal notes he kept, recording the circumstances and his reasoning, understanding that eventually he would need to defend his choices before a military tribunal that would determine whether his disobedience constituted reasonable battlefield judgment or insubordination that warranted severe punishment. The third reprimand had come on November 30th, 1944, 2 weeks before the convoy that would change everything. Whitmore, his patience exhausted and his professional reputation damaged by the growing disorder in his communications network that superiors blamed him for allowing to develop, had informed Cooper that one more violation would result in removal from radio duties and possible criminal charges for insubordination that could lead to imprisonment and dishonorable discharge. The captain had tried a different approach this time, speaking not as an officer to a subordinate, but as one professional to another, man to man, rather than rank to rank. They had met in private, without witnesses, in an office where Whitmore closed the door and offered Cooper a chair rather than keeping him standing at attention. The captain had explained his own frustrations, how he was being pressured by division commanders to solve communication problems, while simultaneously being blamed for the radio discipline issues that Cooper's techniques were creating throughout the network. Whitmore had acknowledged, for the first time, that Cooper's system was faster and possibly more effective in immediate tactical situations than standard protocols. The data showed clear improvements in response times and casualty reduction, but he had asked Cooper to consider the impossible position his innovations were creating for the officers trying to maintain some coherent structure in the chaos of mobile warfare. Whitmore was caught between commanders who wanted better communication speed and regulations that required standardized procedures. He was being pulled in opposite directions by conflicting demands, and Cooper's unauthorized techniques were making that conflict more acute. If Cooper would stop using the unauthorized techniques, Whitmore promised, he would personally work to incorporate Cooper's innovations into official protocols. He would write the proposals, fight the bureaucratic battles, push for formal adoption of compressed communication formats, but the transition had to be orderly and systematic, not chaotic and improvised. Military effectiveness depended on maintaining organizational coherence, even while implementing changes and improvements. Cooper had understood and had sympathized with Whitmore's position. He had promised one more time to follow proper protocols, meaning it sincerely, and hoping desperately that he would not face another situation where that promise conflicted with the duty to protect the men who depended on him. But Whitmore had seen something in Cooper's eyes that told him the promise was hollow, not because Cooper was dishonest, but because Cooper's sense of duty to immediate tactical realities would override his promise to institutional procedures whenever the two came into conflict. The captain had not understood, sitting in his headquarters with his training manuals and his theoretical analyses, that for Cooper, the radio was not merely a piece of equipment or a job assignment. It was the way he protected the men who depended on him, and no threat of punishment could override that fundamental duty that went deeper than military hierarchy or career consequences. Some obligations transcended regulations, and Cooper had accepted that his career would end with a court-martial, rather than abandon soldiers who needed him to communicate faster than regulations allowed. Which brought them to December 14th, 1944, and a supply convoy moving through the Ardennes forest with insufficient intelligence about enemy positions and inadequate protection against the attack everyone knew was coming, but no one could predict with enough precision to prevent. The convoy consisted of 37 trucks carrying supplies for the 106th Infantry Division, which was holding a dangerously extended front line that stretched across 28 kilometers, with insufficient reserves and deteriorating morale among soldiers who had been in continuous combat for 4 months without adequate rest or rotation to rear areas where they could recover physically and psychologically. Each truck carried 3 tons of ammunition, medical supplies, or food rations that represented the difference between an effective defensive position and complete collapse of the entire divisional sector. The ammunition trucks held approximately 75,000 rounds of rifle ammunition in wooden crates stacked to the ceiling, 12,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition in metal cans that had to be handled carefully to prevent jamming, 600 artillery shells ranging from 75mm to 105mm caliber, and 200 hand grenades that soldiers used to clear buildings and defend against infantry assaults. The medical trucks carried plasma for blood replacement, morphine for pain management, bandages and surgical supplies for treating wounds, and antibiotics, including the new penicillin treatments that had dramatically reduced infection mortality rates, but remained in limited supply throughout the front lines. These supplies would determine whether wounded men lived or died in the field hospitals that operated in converted barns and damaged churches where surgeons worked around the clock with equipment that was barely adequate and supplies that were never sufficient. The food trucks held rations calculated to feed 3,000 men for 5 days at field consumption rates, including the canned meat that soldiers called mystery meat because its actual contents remained uncertain, powdered eggs that reconstituted into something vaguely resembling breakfast, coffee that kept exhausted men alert through night watches, and chocolate bars that provided concentrated calories to soldiers who burned 5,000 calories a day, trying to stay warm and alert in sub-freezing conditions. The route had been chosen because it was the fastest connection between supply depots, located 25 kilometers behind the front lines, and the forward positions where the 106th Division desperately needed resupply. The direct route cut through dense forest that provided concealment from aerial observation by enemy reconnaissance aircraft that had recently become more active as German forces prepared for what would become the Battle of the Bulge. The forest cover was considered essential protection because enemy fighters had been intercepting supply convoys on open roads with increasing frequency. Alternative routes existed, longer roads that skirted the forest and offered better sight lines for convoy security, but those routes added 6 hours to the transit time and exposed convoys to possible air attack during daylight hours when visibility was good and enemy fighters operated most effectively. The decision to use the forest route had been made at division level, based on calculations about relative risk that looked reasonable on paper, but failed to account for the possibility that enemy forces had positioned ambush teams specifically along this route because they understood American logistics officers would consider the forest path safer. Cooper rode in the lead vehicle with Private First Class Thomas Garcia, a driver from San Antonio, Texas, who had learned to navigate these impossible roads through 20 weeks of continuous convoy duty that had aged him from 19 to what looked like 40. Garcia's face was weathered beyond his years, with lines around his eyes from squinting through falling snow and darkness, and hands that bore scars from mechanical repairs performed in freezing conditions without proper tools or lighting. He kept the truck at 15 kilometers per hour, fast enough to maintain schedule, but slow enough to handle the ice that turned every curve into a potential disaster, where vehicles could slide off the road or overturn. His hands gripped the steering wheel with the steady pressure of someone who had learned through experience exactly how much force was needed to maintain control without overcorrecting when the vehicle inevitably slid on patches of ice that appeared without warning, invisible beneath fresh snow that concealed the difference between solid pavement and deadly ice. Garcia had survived 19 previous convoy runs through contested territory, had been shot at 11 times, had lost 3 friends to ambushes and accidents, and had developed the fatalistic calm of someone who understood that survival was partly skill, but mostly luck. Behind them, the other 36 trucks followed at precisely measured intervals of 30 meters. Maintaining the spacing that regulations dictated would prevent a single ambush from destroying multiple vehicles simultaneously. Each driver could see the vehicle ahead, but not the one behind, creating a snake-like formation that stretched for more than 1 kilometer along the narrow forest road. The spacing was calculated to balance competing concerns about maintaining visual contact for coordination, while avoiding concentrated targets that would allow enemy gunners to engage multiple vehicles with a single burst of fire. The last truck carried additional radio equipment and a backup operator, Corporal James Henderson from Portland, Oregon, who monitored a different frequency and provided redundancy in case Cooper's equipment failed or was damaged. Henderson was 23 years old, had been a radio operator for 18 months, and had learned his trade from Cooper during shared convoy duties. He used standard protocols religiously, partly because he lacked Cooper's confidence to improvise, and partly because he feared the disciplinary consequences that Cooper seemed to accept as inevitable. The radio in Cooper's lap crackled with routine traffic, units reporting positions, and requesting supply updates through the prescribed formats that turned every simple question into a 3-minute exchange of call signs, authentication codes, and formal acknowledgements. A battalion headquarters 20 kilometers east was requesting ammunition resupply estimates. An artillery battery was reporting mechanical problems with one of their guns. A medical unit was inquiring about plasma availability. All of it conducted through the careful protocols that Whitmore defended, and Cooper had promised to follow. Cooper monitored the transmissions with half his attention, while the other half tracked the forest around them, watching for the signs that experienced soldiers learn to recognize through survival instinct rather than formal training. Birds disturbed from their roosts, taking flight in patterns that indicated something had frightened them from the ground. Snow falling from branches where no wind blew, suggesting movement beneath the trees. The quality of silence that meant predators were nearby, the absence of normal forest sounds that indicated animals had fled from human presence. These were the details that training manuals never mentioned, but that separated soldiers who survived from soldiers who died in situations where the difference was measured in seconds of warning. Cooper had developed these observational skills through 2 years of surviving situations where the difference between life and death came down to noticing details that seemed insignificant until they became crucial. He had learned to trust his instincts, to recognize the patterns that his subconscious mind assembled from thousands of tiny inputs that never reached conscious analysis. He had been shot at enough times to know what the moments before an ambush felt like, the subtle wrongness that made skin prickle and stomach tighten even when no obvious threat was visible. At 1600 hours, approximately 4 in the afternoon, with perhaps 90 minutes of usable daylight remaining, and the temperature dropping toward what the weather forecasters predicted would be -12 degrees Celsius by midnight. They passed through a small village that had been abandoned weeks earlier, when the front line shifted eastward during the Allied advance through Belgium that had followed the Normandy breakout. The village was called Hermanville, though Cooper would not learn that name until much later when he read after-action reports, and it consisted of perhaps 40 buildings clustered around a central square where a stone church with a damaged steeple stood as a reminder of centuries when these streets had known peace. The buildings stood empty, their windows dark, their doors hanging open to reveal interiors where furniture remained. But people had vanished in the evacuation that happened when military forces warned civilians that their homes would become combat zones and safety required leaving behind everything that could not be carried. Tables still held place settings from interrupted meals. Photographs still hung on walls, showing families that had scattered to refugee centers or homes of relatives in areas further from the fighting. Children's toys lay abandoned in yards where snow was now drifting across forgotten gardens, coating swings and bicycles and dolls with white blankets that would remain until spring. Garcia slowed the truck to 10 kilometers per hour as they navigated the narrow street that wound through the village center. His attention focused on avoiding the debris that littered the roadway and threatened tire damage or steering damage if struck at speed. Roof tiles that had been knocked loose by artillery fire during previous fighting lay scattered across the pavement. Broken glass from shattered windows crunched under the truck's tires. The remains of a civilian truck that had been pushed to the side of the road but still partially blocked the street required careful navigation to pass without sideswiping the wreckage. Cooper felt it before he saw anything specific, a wrongness in the atmosphere that made his skin prickle and his breath catch despite the cold, that numbed every exposed surface and made breathing painful when air entered lungs that struggled to warm the frozen intake. He had experienced this sensation before, in North Africa outside Tunis, in Sicily near Messina, in France at Caen. The premonition that came not from supernatural intuition, but from 1,000 tiny observations processed by parts of the brain that worked faster than conscious thought and assembled patterns before rational analysis could identify specific details. The snow on the buildings was undisturbed, accumulated in natural patterns that indicated no one had been near the structures for days or possibly weeks. Wind-driven snow had piled in drifts against walls and doorways in the asymmetric patterns that only natural accumulation created. But the snow on the street showed marks that looked almost like broomstrokes, as if someone had tried to conceal tracks or smooth over evidence of recent activity, by dragging branches or boards across the surface to obliterate footprints or vehicle tracks that would reveal human presence. The abandoned houses sat at perfect angles for observation positions, their upper windows offering clear sightlines down the street in both directions, while providing concealment for observers who would be invisible behind glass that reflected snow and sky without revealing interiors. The curve in the road ahead would force the convoy to slow further as vehicles navigated the turn, bunching them together and reducing the spacing that regulations had established to prevent multiple casualties from single attack, creating exactly the kind of target concentration that made ambushes devastatingly effective by allowing attackers to engage multiple vehicles simultaneously. Most tellingly, the birds were gone. The crows and ravens that normally scavenged in abandoned areas, looking for food in damaged buildings and searching through debris for anything edible, were completely absent. The forest around the village was silent in a way that suggested not winter quiet, but the active silence of animals that had been disturbed and fled. Deer and foxes and rabbits that normally moved through these areas had abandoned the territory, and birds that should have been roosting in the trees were nowhere to be seen or heard. The absence was striking enough that even Garcia noticed it, glancing at Cooper with an expression that needed no words to convey shared concern. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And every instinct Cooper had developed through 2 years of staying alive in situations that killed less observant soldiers was screaming warnings that he could not rationally justify but absolutely could not ignore. There was no visible enemy, no obvious threat, nothing that would qualify as tactical intelligence in an after-action report. But the pattern was there, the accumulated details that individually meant nothing but collectively spelled danger, as clearly as if enemy forces had posted signs announcing their presence. He grabbed the radio handset, his thumb hovering over the transmit button while his mind wrestled with the choice he had sworn to avoid. The decision he had promised Captain Whitmore he would never make again. Standard protocol required him to call battalion headquarters, identify his unit, and position using the prescribed authentication format that would take at least 40 seconds to complete. Request permission to halt the convoy with justification for the request that would need to be detailed enough for command staff to evaluate the threat assessment. Wait for authorization to proceed, or instructions to continue based on higher headquarters analysis of the situation. The entire process, as he had been taught and as he had promised to follow, would take at least 3 minutes, possibly 5 if authentication codes needed to be verified, through higher headquarters because his unit identifier was not immediately recognized, or if the frequency was busy with other traffic and his transmission had to wait for a clear channel. During those 3 to 5 minutes, the convoy would continue rolling forward into what every instinct told him was carefully prepared killing ground, where enemy forces waited with weapons positioned and coordinates calculated, and soldiers prepared to execute an ambush that had been planned and rehearsed over multiple days. The lead trucks would enter the village completely, committed to the narrow street with no room to turn around and no way to reverse course because vehicles behind would block any retreat. The following trucks would bunch together as they slowed for the turn and the debris, presenting concentrated targets for any weapons positioned in the buildings or tree line. If an ambush was indeed waiting ahead, the first indication would be explosions and gunfire erupting from multiple positions simultaneously, and men would die while Cooper was still completing the authentication sequence that protocol demanded, still waiting for authorization that might come too late to save anyone. His thumb pressed the button once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession, the pattern he had developed to mean immediate danger, requiring complete halt of all movement without delay or discussion. The transmission lasted less than 2 seconds, far too brief for enemy direction-finding equipment to locate his position and calculate coordinates for counter-battery fire, but long enough for every radio operator in the convoy who had worked with Cooper and understood his system to recognize that something critical was happening and immediate action was required. Then he tapped out a more complex sequence, using the numerical and rhythm codes he had refined over months of field use, conveying in 12 seconds what should have required 5 minutes of formal transmission according to standard protocols. Enemy positions likely present in village ahead, based on tactical indicators and observation, Convoy halting at current position, pending reconnaissance. Request immediate artillery support standing by for targeting information if contact develops. All vehicles disperse into defensive positions off-road, using available cover. Garcia had already begun braking when Cooper's hand moved toward the radio, the driver's own instincts responding to the same wrongness Cooper had felt in the atmosphere and landscape. The truck slowed smoothly, avoiding the sudden stop that might have caused following vehicles to collide with each other in chain reaction accidents that could disable multiple trucks, and pulled to the right side of the road where trees provided partial cover from the village ahead and a slight depression in the terrain offered some protection from direct fire. Behind them, the other trucks began stopping in a cascade of brake lights, their drivers responding to the radio signal without waiting for official confirmation or authorization through command channels, trusting Cooper's judgment because they had learned through experience that his instincts about danger were more reliable than official intelligence assessments. The convoy came to a halt with vehicles stretched along 800 meters of forest road, engines idling to prevent freezing in the sub-zero temperatures, drivers and passengers suddenly alert to danger they could not yet see but absolutely believed existed based on nothing more than a radio transmission that violated every protocol they had been trained to follow. Decades of military training emphasized trust in leadership, following orders without question, maintaining discipline through adherence to proper procedures. But these men had learned through combat experience that sometimes survival depended on recognizing which orders came from knowledge and which came from bureaucratic reflex, which procedures served actual security needs and which served only institutional inertia that continued long after the original reasoning had become obsolete or inapplicable. Cooper switched frequencies on his radio, contacting the reconnaissance unit that was supposed to be screening their route 10 kilometers ahead and providing early warning of enemy positions or tactical developments that might affect convoy operations. The response came immediately, and it contained information that made Cooper's stomach tighten with fear and vindication in equal measure. The simultaneous recognition that his instincts had been correct and that the danger was even more serious than he had suspected. The reconnaissance unit, consisting of 8 jeeps with mounted machine guns and 32 men who specialized in forward scouting and tactical intelligence gathering, had encountered resistance an hour earlier near the village of Hermanville, while attempting to survey the convoy route and verify that it remained secure. What they had found there was not the usual small patrol or temporary checkpoint, but a prepared defensive position indicating at least company strength. Between 100 and 150 soldiers who had been positioned specifically to intercept supply convoys moving along this exact route. The reconnaissance unit commander, Lieutenant Peter Morrison from Chicago, Illinois, reported that his force had attempted to probe the enemy positions to determine strength and disposition, but had been driven back by accurate fire that suggested well-trained troops with clear fields of observation and good communication between positions rather than improvised checkpoint. His unit had withdrawn to a safe distance after determining that the enemy force was too strong for a reconnaissance element to engage directly, and had been trying for 40 minutes to transmit a warning through official channels that remained clogged with routine traffic and authentication delays. The standard protocol required reconnaissance units to report through their chain of command, which meant transmitting to battalion headquarters using proper authentication and format requirements, waiting for the message to be logged and processed by staff officers who might be handling multiple other priority transmissions, which would then alert division logistics through formal channels, which would then warn convoy commanders through additional formal transmission. But battalion headquarters was handling multiple priority transmissions related to the broader tactical situation as enemy forces launched what would become the Battle of the Bulge, and the reconnaissance warning had been stuck in a queue of lower priority messages waiting for processing by overworked staff officers who were trying to handle communication volume that exceeded their capacity. In the carefully designed system that Captain Whitmore defended as essential for maintaining organizational coherence, this should not have happened because procedures existed to prioritize urgent tactical intelligence over routine administrative traffic. But in the reality of military operations where communication channels were overwhelmed by operational demands, that exceeded peacetime planning assumptions. It happened constantly. The perfect system described in training manuals collided with imperfect reality, where human operators made mistakes and equipment failed, and unexpected situations created demands that no planning could fully anticipate. The village ahead contained elements of the German army, at least company strength with possibly battalion-level support, equipped with anti-tank weapons and machine guns, positioned to ambush any convoy that attempted to pass through without proper reconnaissance or security screening. Lieutenant Morrison's unit had visual confirmation of at least 6 prepared positions with fields of fire calculated to create overlapping coverage that would prevent vehicles from escaping once the ambush was triggered. Based on the sophistication of the positions and the discipline of the troops who had maintained concealment, despite being discovered by the reconnaissance element, Morrison estimated this was not an improvised checkpoint, but a deliberately planned ambush that had been positioned and prepared over several days by troops who understood American convoy procedures and had calculated their tactics accordingly. An ambush of this size and sophistication represented a significant threat, capable of destroying the entire convoy if it had continued into the killing zone without warning or preparation. The lead trucks would have been hit by anti-tank weapons at point-blank range within the narrow confines of the village street, blocking the route and trapping following vehicles in a confined space where they could not maneuver or escape. Machine gun positions in the buildings would have raked the trapped vehicles with enfilading fire from multiple angles, killing drivers and passengers who had no cover and no ability to fight back effectively against concealed positions. The entire engagement would have lasted perhaps 10 minutes, and at the end of it, 37 trucks and 230 men would have been lost, along with the critical supplies that the 106th Infantry Division needed to maintain their defensive positions during the coming offensive. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.